This video is of a public hearing held by the East Lansing Independent Police Oversight Commission on March 29, 2023. The hearing was a hybrid meeting, including people gathered at the Michigan State University College of Law and people joining on Zoom. About 80 people attended. Inadvertently, the recording began about 6 minutes into the meeting. So this is a recap of the start of the event, then continuing with the hearing itself. I'm Chris Root, Vice Chair of the Commission. The meeting began with a brief welcome by MSU College of Law Dean Linda Green. Eric Williams, Chair of the Independent Police Oversight Commission, then opened a special meeting of the Commission. He recognized the Commission members who were present. Amanda Morgan, Robin Etchison, Kath Edsel, and the Chair and Vice Chair. I then introduced the hearing on the subject of best practices in police use of force policy and training. The East Lansing City Council adopted an ordinance in 2021 that created this commission. That ordinance provides that if 20 residents of the city sign a petition on an issue of concern within the scope of the commission shall hold a public hearing for the purpose of inquiring into the petitioner's concern. Calling for a hearing is one way the council put in place to encourage community members to participate in the work of the commission. At the Oversight Commission's September 2022 meeting, we received a petition signed by 33 East Lansing residents. It called for a hearing to obtain testimony from experts and members of the public about national best practices for policies and procedures, as well as recommended training regarding use of force, especially as it pertains to the policing of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That is what we are doing today, hearing from 4 people about national best practices, followed by comments and discussion. The petition goes on to say, the purpose of such a hearing is to make well-researched recommendations about the East Lansing Police Department's use of force policy, including procedure and training. The Oversight Commission realized right away that it was impossible to do all of this in one meeting. So tonight we're learning about national best practices. The Oversight Commission is planning next steps to carefully review ELPD's use of force policy, hear from the department about its policy, and discuss ideas for recommendations about the policy to make to the department. The ELPD policy that the Commission will be reviewing is called Response to Resistance Policy and Procedure. ELPD updated this policy in July 2022 to meet accreditation standards of the Michigan Association of Chiefs of Police. I should also point out that the petition was a response to the officer-involved shooting of a young Black man, DeAnthony Van Natten, in the Meyer parking lot on April 25, 2022. Both the Michigan State Police and ELPD have completed their investigations of the incident. ELPD has told the Oversight Commission that it will transmit its document to the Commission soon. The Oversight Commission will review the report and discuss it at least one upcoming meeting. Our open meetings are on the first Wednesday of each month at 6 o'clock at the Hannah Community Center. Let me add that we're excited that the MSU College of Law is co-sponsoring this hearing with us. We especially thank Professor Grasso, who did a lot of planning with us. She also is chair of the Michigan State University Police Department Oversight Committee. Also, we thank Marianne Ferguson, an attorney and the founder of the MSU College of Law's Diversity and Equity Services Office, for her enthusiastic and generous assistance, and Dean Linda Green for her support and her welcome tonight. We hope that the Oversight Commission and the MSU College of Law will develop more ways to work together in the future. Now we will proceed with the public hearing.
So now let me introduce the speakers at the hearing, each of whom will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. I keep mentioning there are 4 speakers, and I know you're seeing only 3, and that will become clear in a moment. The first speaker will be Dr. Angie Weiss-Gamel. She's Policy Director of the Wilson Center for Science and Justice at Duke University. She will present the American Law Institute's Principles of Policing regarding use of force. Dr. Chuck Wexler, who is not up here, is Executive Director of the Police Executive Research Forum, or PERF. and he will discuss PERF's 30 guiding principles on use of force. Dr. Wexler recorded his presentation with us last week because he's out of the country tonight. His colleague, Tom Wilson, is on Zoom with us from Washington, D.C. So that, oh, there we go. Thank you for being here. So we'll have somebody from PERF able to participate in the discussion and question and answer. Pastor Sean Holland is representing One Love Global, Black Lives Matter Lansing, and Black Lives Matter of Michigan. He works with others to support families and victims of police violence and to address police use of force in Lansing, East Lansing, and Grand Rapids. And Dr. Trevor Bechtel is the Student Engagement and Strategic Project Manager of Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He recently co-authored the paper, Evidence on Measures to Reduce Excessive Use of Force by the Police. And he brought some copies of that paper if you'd like to pick one up. So now I turn it back over to Eric, and we can proceed in the order that I mentioned.
All right, Dr. ML.
Great. I am not a doctor, so for better or worse, I am a lawyer by background. So no, that is okay. I'll just correct the record. Lawyer by background. I'm currently the policy director at a place called the Wilson Center for Science and Justice, which is housed at Duke Law. And we have 3 areas of focus as a center, which are equity and criminal outcomes, accuracy of evidence, and behavioral health. And so while we don't have one singular focus on policing, policing is of course woven throughout those 3 areas because police interact with people with behavioral health conditions, and police collect evidence, and police have a lot to do with whether or not the criminal legal system is equitable, from things that happen on the front end to things that happen on the back end. So policing is really integral to the work that we do. And prior to coming to the Wilson Center, I was the senior advisor for public safety in the Chicago mayor's office, where my portfolio included mainly violence reduction and police reform efforts under the Chicago consent decree. So that's sort of my background in policing coming to this role. The Wilson Center had a large role in developing the American Law Institute Principles on Policing, which were released earlier this year in January 2023. Specifically, Brandon Garrett, who is our faculty director of the center, was one of the reporters for the principles. And that work spanned over 7 years of bringing together a large group of advisors, which included current and retired law enforcement officers, judges, private attorneys, community members, activists, advocates, who all advised the process. And over the 7-year process, they built consensus among both those advisors and the ALI members and council on these principles. And so I'm sort of here today to sort of go over what those principles entail. In my role at the center as the policy director, I'm sort of tasked with translating the expertise and the research that our center does, including the work on these principles, into impact. And so thinking about opportunities to speak with community members about the resource that's available in these principles. I'm also working on translating some of the principles into model policies, model legislation that communities and states can look to as they look to implement some of the things that are contained in the principles. So with that, I'll sort of talk about initially a few of the general principles that are contained in the ALI principles on policing, and then there's a chapter that's specific to use of force. And so I'll do a brief overview of each of those principles on use of force as well. But I think it's important to start with the broad principles because they underlie what follows with respect to use of force. So the first general principle that I want to talk about are the goals of policing. So ALI has defined the goals of policing as being to promote a safe and secure society, to preserve the peace, to address crime, and to uphold the law. So for police use of force to be legitimate, it must be done to further at least one of those goals. So that means it should make society more safe, not less. It must be done only in accordance with the law. And it should only be used when there's a clear threat of a crime. So this context sort of provides baseline requirements for the use of force that I think are important as we just sort of begin the discussion. The second general principle that I wanted to highlight is reducing harm. So the ALI says that agencies should pursue the goals of policing in ways that reduce attendant or incidental harms. Harm reduction underlies many of the more specific principles and requirements that we'll talk about, such as using the least force necessary, the duty to render aid, and de-escalation. And then the third general principle that I wanted to talk about is interacting with vulnerable populations. The ALI principle says that vulnerable groups may face special challenges in their interactions with police. So they must be treated like all people with sensitivity and respect. Officers need to be trained to recognize potential vulnerabilities, how to interact safely, and how to respond to individuals in crisis in ways that minimize the risk of harm. So I wanted to raise vulnerable populations as an important consideration because in my review of the East Lansing Police Department's use of force incidents, which I reviewed about a little over a year's worth of incidents, it's very clear that people experiencing behavioral health or mental health crises are making up a significant portion of incidents where use of force is used. And what that means is that there's a real opportunity for improvement by rethinking some of the current practices on calls where there's a response to someone who might be in crisis or someone who might be a part of a vulnerable population. So those are sort of the general principles I wanted to touch on. And then as we move into what's specific to the use of force, there are really 5 principles in that chapter. Technically, they have 6, but one is just sort of like introductory language. So the one I'll start with is objectives of the use of force. So that says officers should use physical force only for the purposes of effecting a lawful seizure, so such as an arrest, carrying out a lawful search, preventing imminent harm to themselves or others, or preventing property damage or loss. So really these limits are the same ones that I sort of talked about stemming from the goals of policing at the beginning. Then the second principle talks about minimum force necessary. So when force is used, officers should use the absolute minimum force necessary to perform their duties safely. This standard really goes beyond the general reasonableness standard applied pursuant to the US Supreme Court precedents. And that general reasonableness standard is the same one that's reflected in the current ELPD policy. And to be fair, it's common across the United States, across police departments in many communities. For a long time, that has been the standard. But what the ALI is urging departments and communities to do is to go one step further and say, it's not just that it has to be reasonable, it has to be the least force necessary. So force should not be used simply to resolve a situation more quickly, unless an extended delay would risk human safety or would significantly interfere with law enforcement objectives. Force is unnecessary if it's carried out either before a legitimate objective has presented itself or after the threat or the objective has been resolved, which creates this ongoing duty for officers to reassess whether the continued use of force is necessary when it's safe and feasible to do so. So that ongoing evaluation is an important component of using minimum force necessary. And then the third principle specific to use of force is de-escalation and force avoidance. So this says that agencies should require officers to actively seek to avoid using force whenever possible by employing techniques such as de-escalation. So examples of these sort of techniques that can be used to de-escalate or avoid use of force include things like tactical repositioning to increase distance or cover, containing the scene to make sure that you've reduced the threat to the public, avoiding acts or instructions that are likely to lead an individual to present a serious risk of harm to the officer, which can then escalate a situation as more and more commands are being given. So avoiding that sort of practice. But there are also things that an agency can do to sort of help with de-escalation and help avoid the use of force, such as providing officers on scene with additional information about what's happening, sending additional resources, facilitating communications, and employing specially trained staff or people with specific qualifications to interact with vulnerable populations. So those are some things that can be done sort of at the agency level and aren't put on the individual officers. And then the fourth principle of use of force is proportionality. So officers should not use more force than is proportionate to the legitimate law enforcement objective at stake. Deadly force should not be used except in response to an immediate threat of serious physical harm or death to officers or others. So that's a really important sort of limitation on when certain types of force can be used. And non-deadly force should not be used if its impact is likely to be out of proportion to the threat of harm or to the societal interests at stake. So this principle really does sort of a lot of work, and it operates in addition to the requirement of necessity. So proportionality demands that in some instances, law enforcement interests go unserved if achieving them would impose undue harm, right? So there are times when an officer may be undertaking some activity that is within the goals of sound policing, but to effectuate that search or make that arrest, some amount of force would be necessary that goes beyond what is justified given the circumstances. So this is where taking into account what is the offense at hand. And there are certain instances where for lower level crimes or for lower level traffic enforcement, if any amount of force is going to be required to detain someone or to effectuate an arrest when they're trying to resist or trying to escape, that actually these principles say it's better to just not make that arrest. It's better to not continue that search. And being able to walk away is sort of something that I think a lot of departments are not currently used to doing, and instead things escalate, but sort of building into training and into consideration that there are times when submission and compliance don't justify use of force, that the crime at hand or whatever the person is suspected of just does not warrant it. And I think reviewing the East Lansing current policy with sort of the proportionality principle in mind really highlights some of the areas that could really be substantially changed. And then the last principle on use of force from ALI is on instructions and warnings. So it says that officers should provide clear instructions and warnings whenever feasible before using force. And this includes indicating the consequences of refusing to comply with a mandatory order. So under the current policy, stop police is considered a sufficient warning, but this would not be considered sufficient under the ALI principles because it's not telling the person, okay, it's police, but what does that mean, right? What are the police intending to do with their presence? What might happen if I don't respond or don't comply with the order that they're giving me? So those are the 5 principles that ALI laid out on the use of force. Across each of these principles, they reiterate the importance of having written policies. So it's really important that the department have clear written policies that are available to the public. They reiterate the importance of training. So having training that is robust, happens on a recurring basis, and covers all of these issues. And in that training, the sanctity of human life must be at the forefront and woven throughout, and also principles of harm reduction, and talking about harm reduction throughout training and throughout, weapons training, and not having it just be one sort of small subset of training, but instead really weaving it throughout. And then reporting and review of use of force incidents is also really important. So reporting should be done in a timely manner, which means as soon as possible and always within the same shift, right? There shouldn't be an incident where the officer is able to go home for the day, reflect on what happened, and then file their incident report. It needs to happen as close to the event as possible, but definitely in the same shift. And then also reports should be done in a consistent way. So ideally there's a form or a template that they're following. So each piece of important information is included every single time so that there's a clear record of what happened and all the relevant information is collected and available. And then supervisors and leadership need to review the report incidents, And I think it's also really important for transparency reasons that those reports be made available to the public, which my understanding is East Lansing does. So that's really great. But I do think there's room for improvement on the consistency of what's reported and making sure that each report contains all the information that you would need to really have an understanding of the incident that happened and what played out. So those principles really are meant to be guides on best practices to help departments and to help residents understand what is considered best practice. It doesn't lay out necessarily a list of categorical bans, but reasonable application of those principles might lead a department to very logically determine that certain categories of use of force are off limits once you think about proportionality and you think about least force necessary and those sorts of things. So I'll stop there. I think I'm probably around 10 minutes. Great, maybe.
So can we go to the tape of Chuck Wexler?
Take my notes. Just take a minute.
Did the right thing so far.
I'm Chris Root, Vice Chair of the East Lansing Independent Police Oversight Commission, and I'm happy to be interviewing Chuck Wexler, the Executive Director of the Police Executive Research Forum. He was not able to be with us in person, but he agreed to have this conversation beforehand, which we really appreciate. So to start, what is the Police Executive Research Forum, or PERF, and what has its role been in the national debate about police use of force policy?
Well, Christine, first of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person. So the Police Executive Research Forum, or PERF as we're called, was this idea that, major city chiefs had almost 50 years ago, that there should be an organization that looks at, challenges critical issues, challenges conventional thinking, and has the ability to do research on itself. That was a kind of an idealistic, bold idea 50 years ago. No one really thought it was possible. They thought inherently it would be a conflict with police chiefs studying themselves. But here we are, almost 50 years later. We have a team in Washington made up of people like me with experience in police departments, and also I have a doctorate, prosecutors, lawyers, former police people, researchers, a very kind of eclectic staff. And we operate sort of independently. We call it like we see it. We have the benefit of providing, of working with departments and getting access to information. And even though sometimes what we say is critical of policing, it's done in a constructive way to make a difference. And that's what we've done. We've done hundreds of reports, studied many departments, best practices, identified cutting edge principles. So that's who we are. We're a think tank. We're also have, thousands of members, academics, police chiefs, and so forth who follow us.
So I know that the PERF developed 30 guidelines about use of force policy in particular. And can you maybe pull out 2 or 3 of those guidelines that you think are the most important?
So in 2016, kind of in the wake of all of the discussion back then, if you can believe it, so there was a city in Ferguson, in Missouri, where a lot of issues evolved out of that. When we got together, we began thinking, brought people together, and the long and the short of it is we developed these guiding principles on use of force, 30 of them. And at the time, interestingly enough, when we issued them, they were very controversial. Major unions and management came out, and they were very critical of our recommendations. Today, I don't think anyone is critical. And they were things like, number one obligation of police is the sanctity of human life. That's the number one responsibility. for both citizens and police alike, the sanctity of human life. But then there are other things that you're familiar with today, but back then not as familiar. Duty to intervene. In the wake of the Rodney King incident 30 years ago, the real question was, why didn't anyone step forward? Why didn't Sergeant Stacy Kuhn step forward and stop? Along with that came duty to render aid in a use of force situation. After everything is, after the person is under control, if they're hurt, they have a responsibility to aid that person. It goes back to the number one thing, sanctity, human life, and the critical decision model, which is sort of the operating system we think that police should have when they encounter a use of force situation. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But basically, those concepts and proportionality. The concept, something we learned when I was in the United Kingdom is, it's not, it's about proportionality. Is the force I'm using proportionate to whatever I'm dealing with? And if it isn't, why am I using that force? So those were, the major kinds of concepts: critical decision model, sanctity of human life, duty to intervene, duty to render aid, and proportionality.
Those certainly are issues that a lot of people talk about today. You're right. One of the things I noticed in the guidelines is the recommendation that the use of force continuum is out of date.
Correct.
And here in Michigan, the Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards, or MCOLS, is still using the continuum.
Right.
So could you tell us why you think it should be discontinued, and why it's still so prevalent, and you think it should be dropped?
I think, when you think about use of force, the conventional thinking was if someone uses this amount of force against a police officer, the police officer should use additional force to overcome that force. So it's sort of an escalating situation where additional force is used. And you look in the Tyree Nichols case, officers didn't, one particular, they'd use this, that didn't work, then they try something, and then that didn't work, and then they try something else. Escalating force. And what we said is that doesn't make sense, because there are situations in which you might want to step back, or you might want to ask yourself, is the force I'm using proportionate to whatever someone did? And if it isn't, then why are you using additional force? In other words, there are some situations where stepping back and rethinking whatever approach you have, makes more sense. Unfortunately, the way police are taught is you always have to win, at any cost. Well, we know that at any cost isn't worth it. I mean, for example, if you have someone who's committed vandalism, if you have someone who's stolen a car, some kind of shoplifting and whatever, if in the course of trying to get them under control, you realize this situation is escalating, the critical decision model says, what do I have here? Am I the most appropriate one? Can I get this person another day? Because if this minor offense is escalating because someone doesn't want to get arrested, is it okay if I know who this person is, or even have we discussed the possibility that, this person isn't going to go to jail? I mean, no one that I know of, very rarely do people go to jail for stealing a car. Yet, for some departments, stealing a car and, engaging in a pursuit at very high speeds where both the suspect and the police officer could both get injured, and a third party who just happens to be out that day could get injured because, the police are pursuing it, and because the police don't have a policy on that. You say to yourself, is it worth it? That's not how policing has been. That's not how police have been taught. They've been taught, you're in charge. You need to, you always need to win. Well, sometimes winning is stepping back and repositioning yourself and asking those kind of questions. That's where proportionality comes in. And that's the difference between a critical decision model and a use of force continuum. Use of force continuum is slightly escalating force. And at the end of the day, what you have to say, what is it worth? Now, having said that, if you have the Boston bomber from the marathon, and that person is about to, has bombs in their car and they're about to kill other people, then that's very different. But in most cases, all officers know is, that, and I think that's, by the way, that leads into the critical decision model, which is basically a model that has officers ask a series of questions. And it talks about proportionality, ethics. Are you the most appropriate person to handle something, especially perhaps in a situation where you have someone in some kind of crisis and, it's just not going well. And maybe the person is only a danger to themselves. Classic case, police officer gets called, mother is concerned about her kid. He's up in his room. Police knock on the door, open the door, and there's the kid, hasn't been on medication and has a knife in his hands. Police officer pulls out a gun and tells him to drop the knife. Well, in that situation, when the kid is in his room by himself and controlled, that mother doesn't want the police to take his life. But yet, if the police have been trained in use of force continuum, they see a knife, they take out their gun because that's how they've been trained, and they bark orders, but he's only a danger to himself. And people could say, well, maybe he's going to take his own life. Well, that's a maybe. But at this point, you're escalating the force because you're fearful. And that's where Graham versus Connor comes in. Graham versus Connor is basically, if officers fear for their lives, they're justified in using force. Well, think about this. If they've been taught the use of force continuum, if they open that door and they see that individual with a knife, and they think their objective when they see that knife is immediately to pull out the gun and start barking orders. Well, with someone who's suicidal, the absolute worst thing you can do, absolute worst thing to do with someone suicidal is point the gun at them. Why do I say that? Because we've talked to psychologists, we've studied videos where police confront someone who's suicidal. And when they take out their gun, that person in some cases will walk toward the gun saying, shoot me, shoot me, shoot me. Why? Because if you could get into their head, you would realize what they really want to do is they want to die. And in this case, the police are escalating the force by pointing the gun in that person's head. They hear that and they start walking toward the police, fear for their life, Graham versus Connor, and they shoot them. And they feel like they're justified because they were in fear of their life. So if you're using that use of force continuum, in that situation, you're doing what the worst thing that mother wants is you're taking that child's life. And yet it happens. And I don't blame the police because that's how they've been taught. By the way, whenever I'm asked about why the police do what they do, I say the same thing. In 90% of the time, that's how they've been taught. And that's why that training is out of date. And that's why, if another one of the guiding principles is if a person is a danger only to themselves, then step back. Don't make the situation worse. And that's maybe in that situation, stepping back, closing the door, letting the person cool down, communicating, using good tactics, using time and distance. And that leads into our ICAT training, which comes out of all of this de-escalation, because we thought it wasn't enough to simply have guiding principles. You had to have an operating system, which is based on, the principles, slowing things down, using time and distance, and having this critical decision model. That's what isn't happening now. We don't integrate tactics and communication and psychology and understanding people in crisis. Don't respond to more force. If they're in crisis, what they will respond to is lowering it, de-escalating, slowing down, communicating, getting time and distance. We want the police officer to be safe. So we, in situations which we observed when I was in Scotland, when police are confronted with someone with a knife, the first thing they do is they begin to step back and start communicating and use time and distance and get cover so they're safe so they can communicate to kind of diffuse it. Here, if someone sees someone with a knife, the first thing they do is they pull out their gun, they aim it at them, and they bark orders. That's how they've been taught. We need to change that thinking. Department that has the use of force continuum is not doing itself any good. It's old thinking, and we're going to continue to see, unnecessary lives taken and careers destroyed, I might add. when we developed ICAT and people said to us, and after these guidelines say, you're going to get police officers hurt, you're going to get them killed. Well, that really, that was something we took seriously. Turns out that ICAT has been implemented in a number of cities, integrating communication assessment tactics, and evaluated in a major city, Louisville. And it reduces overall use of force, random control study, use of force against the citizen, and use of force against the officers. So all of that to say it's good. Has this been done in some cities around the country? Yes, a number. In Volusia County, Florida, reduced use of force. In Baltimore, Maryland, reduced use of force. In Camden County, one of the more violent communities, violence has gone down and use of force against citizens. So this isn't just, a Washington police think tank, with their head, in an ivory tower. This is real good stuff that if adopted, believe me, the good news is that when people understand this, they say, that makes sense. Intuitively, slowing things down, time and distance and communicating is so much better than rushing in and not having a plan and then facing the consequences of it not going well.
Next on the list. All right. Mordecai.
All right. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to testify and to be able to speak on behalf of our community, especially our Black community. I want to preface my statements by saying that my statements tonight are motivated by love of community. I'm a father of 4 Black children. I've been pastoring and serving this community for 30 years, and I serve as the co-lead of BLM Lansing, as well as on the BLM Michigan leadership team. And specifically, my role with BLM Lansing is to provide support for families and victims of police violence, police brutality, and police murder. And I saw on Twitter the other day an iceberg, and at the very top, the water was at the very top of the iceberg. And it basically said that this discussion that we're having tonight is a response to the police use of force and brutality that has been captured on camera. That if we did not have the cameras, we wouldn't be in this room tonight. But what about all of the incidents that have happened that have gone uncaptured? Families have not received justice, no closure. And so I want to provide a perspective tonight. Again, I said my statements are based in love. And I had the opportunity, our team, to support Patrick Leoya, DeAnthony Van Adden, and a host of others. We like to start these discussions with truth. We can't solve a problem if we're not really willing to really identify the root of it. And so we have a process called TRHT, which is Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And the T stands for truth telling. So let's level set. The truth is that policing in America started as slave patrols. Over 400 years, Black people have been hunted, beaten, brutalized, and murdered at the hands of the state. Black people have never had the opportunity to roam free without surveillance and monitoring. We've been told, you're on the wrong side of town, you're on the wrong side of the railroad tracks. The painful truth is that many did not survive these interactions with police, and they were denied the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. And we stand almost 3 months on the anniversary of BLM was birthed as a result of the acquittal of George Zimmerman after Trayvon Martin's murder. We're 10 years after that murder and tragedy. And so our people have a long history of state-sanctioned violence and murder, which includes police brutality, violence, and murder, with no accountability. We can have all of the policies that we want, but if there is no measure to hold police and elected officials accountable, we will continue to have this conversation. Here's the truth. How did we get here? Police have always been at the forefront and weaponized against Black people. Think about this. Police were used to enforce Black codes. We remember that. Police were used to enforce Jim Crow. We remember that. Police were used to enforce resistance during the Civil Rights Movement. We remember that. My grandmother, my mother, my father were there when the water hoses were turned on them, the German shepherds were turned on them. Police were used to enforce the war on drugs, the war on crime that disproportionately impacted Black families. Now here we are in 2023, 400 plus years, and police are still tear gassing protesters. We are at a new point where even federal charges have been lodged against protesters and others have been murdered. This ongoing history of violence and murder demands abolition. As Attorney Gemmell stated, I want to read what she said because this is important. I took notes that part of the policy is, and police use of force is interacting with vulnerable portions of the community. This history is real. And until we are willing to really address the root cause of why at the intersection of every measurement, every indicator, African Americans are at the center, Black and brown people. So let's look at this. Let's go into the belly of the beast. DeAnthony Van Aden was shot as East Lansing police officers violated their own police policies and city ordinance. No accountability. We heard the officer say he's got a gun. Okay, but we've heard the testimony here of experts. There were many officers and they fired back in the direction of innocent citizens. From the video, we saw that when they finally shot Van Aden, the priority was to find the gun, which they didn't find on him, and then medical care. But then there's the case of Patrick Lyoya, Grand Rapids Police. 8 a.m. in the morning on a rainy day, a regular traffic stop. He was stopped. He was approached by the officer, and the officer gave him a command that he really didn't understand. What happened? As a result of Patrick Lyoya not yielding his commands, he escalated the incident and ended up mounting Patrick Lyoya like an animal and shot him at point blank range in the back of the head. The investigation revealed that the bullet went through Patrick Lyoya's brain, came out on the other side, and the elasticity of his skin held the bullet inside. And then there's the case of John Fleming, falsely accused while shopping at Walmart on Corona Road in Flint, Michigan. Loss Prevention called the Flint Township Police and said that they saw a Black man was stealing. What did John Fleming do? He had no idea that he had been called. He had been misprofiled. He left Walmart, got on the city bus, and the Flint Township Police stopped the bus, got on the bus, and drug John Fleming off of the bus and assaulted him, and then arrested him. When they got him to the station, they uncovered that he had the receipts in the bag. BLM hosted a citywide town hall prior to COVID. Numerous stories of people from across this region who had experienced and expressed the loss of loved ones by the hands of police, and even those who have come up missing after interactions with police. And so how have our elected officials responded? More money, more cameras, more surveillance, more legal immunity, more power. Yet in 2022, the statistics prove that police killed more US citizens than ever before. I want to take you into the belly of the beast. I want you to hear what the defense argued, because this challenges the law and the relationship between the law and policy. And I want you to hear what the defense argues in the case with Patrick Lyoya. The defense argued that the murder of Patrick Lyoya was necessary because Scheer was defending himself against Patrick Lyoya, who had on flip-flops on a rainy day. The law in dispute, in which the prosecutor showed that probable cause as to the necessity of the murder, defense argued that Patrick's death was not a crime because common law protects the police officer under the circumstance. If you go back 100 years in Michigan common law, the police officer has a right to end the threat if encountered a fleeing felon, resisting arrest, or assaulting an officer. The judge then asked, how was Patrick, in the mind of the officer, considered a fleeing felon when there are 9 legal definitions of a fleeing felon? And I want to ask you this. Murder, had he committed murder? No. Had he committed robbery? No. Had he committed manslaughter? No. Had he committed rape? No. Had he committed sodomy? No. Had he committed burglary? No. Had he committed larceny? No. Had he committed arson? No. But the 9th definition is mayhem. And they said that Patrick Lyoya, death and murder was justifiable, this use of force, because he was committing mayhem. They begin to say, further went on to say that, and I want everyone to hear this, the methods that Officer Scheer used were in line with his training. Patrick failed to obey the commands. There was a language barrier, and he moves from passive resistance to active resistance. Patrick escalates from passive aggression to active aggression. This is police training. MCOS requires, and I want you all to hear this, MCOS requires officers to pursue suspects day and night, even in unfamiliar terrain. Failure to abide by this could be viewed as cowardice. That's slave patrolling. And so I submit this to us today to consider these realities. If we cannot hold police officers and we cannot hold departments and sheriff's associations accountable, then we're dancing around the fire. And so I wanted to just kind of lay this out, that police have been used to weaponize, been used as weapons against the Black community. And so one of the things that we recognize is that we have to end qualified immunity. We have to end qualified immunity. And I know that's a tall order, but if police know that they cannot be sued civilly and they're protected under the nuances of the law, and in a police officer's mind, this is what the training says, is that whenever a command is given, it takes a few moments for the brain of the officer to respond. So if the police officer gives the command and the suspect, like Van Aden, which they had no idea who he was when they shot him, that the mind has at least a 3 to 5 second response, that the officer should receive some grace according to the law. So what we see is that the laws protect the officer. So we've come tonight to ask, who are you protecting? And who are you serving? If police are everywhere, you're in schools, you're at hospitals, you're at the malls, airports, they're everywhere. And so what we see is the protection under the law is one of the largest contributors to police use of force. And would we be here if we hadn't captured George Floyd on video? I yield my time.
Dr. Patel.
Good evening, and thanks so much all for having me here this evening. I'm going to start by saying a couple of words about why Poverty Solutions, a 6-year-old research initiative at a little university just down the road, published a brief on police reform. We see poverty as the interlinked systems, housing, education, criminal justice, labor markets that fail to function as they should for people with low incomes. This approach puts the emphasis on the structural rather than the individual causes of poverty and recognizes that these failures are the result of long-term racial and socioeconomic inequalities. Our early work was focused on innovative solutions to preventing and alleviating poverty in healthcare, education, housing, taxation, and workforce development. We began writing this report in the summer of 2020 for a variety of reasons. The murder of George Floyd was a key turning point. But I was also looking for good projects for students during the pandemic, and we were interested if there were ways that we could contribute to larger conversations building from our strengths in the methods of social science, especially literature review and data analysis. Personally, I was interested in connecting this work to other work that I was engaged in around transparency and alternatives to the criminal justice system. We decided to use students to begin a review of a number of the reforms currently being discussed, 8 Can't Wait, the George Floyd Act, and others. And being discussed and implemented across the country and identify the empirical evidence regarding their effectiveness. So we are looking for what we know works. And the first finding is that there is very limited evidence on use of force policies. This is due to 2 distinct challenges. There are very few studies that isolate the causal effect of specific policies. So we know that places with chokehold bans or verbal warnings or the duty to intervene are correlated with fewer police killings. But we don't know that these policies cause the reduction in police violence. Other factors could be at play, and I'll discuss this a bit further later. This kind of causal research is often very difficult and costly to conduct. Equally important, very few police departments or other law and order agencies release or even collect data on their work. The data that do exist are often partial, not standardized, and based on varying definitions. So I'm grateful to Attorney Weiss-Gamel and Dr. Wexler for working on standards that can start to shift the situation. Most criminal justice data systems were developed with a case management approach and require significant cleaning and analysis before the data can be studied. Since the baseline data are so poor, any data on reform will also be poor. Increased transparency and accountability are necessary to understanding the effectiveness of any reform. So the specific reforms that we addressed include de-escalation training, use of force continuums, chokehold bans, requiring officers to give verbal warnings, prohibiting shooting at moving vehicles, requiring that all reasonable alternatives be exhausted prior to the use of deadly force, the duty to intervene, reporting use of force, no-knock warrants, the use of body cameras, residency requirements, racial diversification, implicit bias training, and limiting the transfer of military equipment to law enforcement. We also addressed the topic of gun control and evidence of its impact. And anytime I begin a list like that, I should say, you don't need to write it down. You can get a copy of the paper, but I always end up saying it at the end of the list. So we found that 3 of these reforms have a good evidence base. Body-worn cameras, especially when law enforcement does not have the discretion over whether the cameras are turned on and off, is the reform with the most promise for police departments to relatively quickly reduce their use of force rates. Diversity. Black and women officers are less likely to use force against civilians, especially against Black civilians. And gun control. Of all of the policies that we considered, stricter firearm policies had the most consistent relationship with the reduced use of force among police. We typically talk about gun regulation in the wake of school shootings, but our research shows that these conversations are equally relevant to police shootings. I suggested earlier that other factors could explain why some communities experience less police violence. The culture of our communities and of our law and order agencies are important factors shaping the interface between law enforcement and the public. Cultural level influences determine how police officers perform their jobs, how policies and reforms are implemented, and therefore how they affect individuals who come into contact with police officers. Our social identity, especially our racial and gender identities, affect our lived experience, and our experiences shape how we interact with others. I'm grateful to the testimony of Pastor Holland for the vivid description of that here this evening. The regulation of guns is a good example of this. Public's level of access to guns is strongly and consistently associated with use of force rates, and particularly fatal police shootings. This makes sense. If police need to expect that any encounter could be won with a gun, it changes how they need to interact. It changes how they're trained, as we've heard this evening. The relationship between more gun regulations and lower rates of police shootings is a strong argument for restrictive gun policies. But it does paint an overly simplistic picture to not mention racial disparities in legal access to arms or the right to self-protection. US policing and gun rights policies have been structured and employed in such a way that Black homes are both less protected by the police and can do less to protect themselves. So we need to acknowledge this in both policing and gun rights policies moving forward. We reviewed many studies for this brief, and you can review our work if you click through from our brief to the database of articles that we've published on the Poverty Solutions website, poverty.umich.edu. We found that gun control had the strongest connection to use of force, that body cameras had the most promising connection for immediate impact. Diversity in policing also has a significant impact and points to the importance of understanding the cultures of our institutions and communities. In all of this work, we need to recognize the need for more and better data across the criminal legal system. So I'm going to end by giving you the most predictable of sentences. As a university researcher, I think we need more research.
Well, thank you. And now I think what we'll do is open it up to questions to any of our panelists.
I have a question.
Robin.
Yeah, on some of your professional opinions and research and everything, it's obvious that over the last 300 or 400 years that the methods and the tactics for policing has been the same for approximately 300 or 400 years. I mean, the same tactics, the same approach, same attitude, the same philosophies. A lot of people disagree with that, but a lot of people don't live where I live. A lot of people have experienced what I've experienced, and I can reflect all the way back to being a small child in the 60s. The things that was taking place in the 60s in my community is the same thing that's taking place today. So just in my lifetime, that hasn't changed. So I'm just leading into that to say this. What is it, what will it take, or what do you think it may take for the police to change some of their approaches and some of their philosophies to policing? One of the things that I've encountered, first of all, let me explain. I have 3 police officers in my family. I have 2 retired and 1 active. My granddaughter is a police person in Atlanta, Georgia, and she says she's encountered 2 forms of policing down there in training. One form is the police have the approach is you do what I tell you to do when they encounter a person. You do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it and how I tell you to do it. And if you don't do it, there will be consequences. And they're usually violent. Then the other approach that she fell under with some of the training officers is like, hey, wait a minute, let's stop for a moment. Let's assess the situation. Let's talk to the person. Let's try and find out what's really wrong, what's really going on. So what do you think that will take people, the police, to actually change some of their attitudes and some of their approaches, some of their philosophies and the way they approach policing today, which is, in my view, outdated and antiquated?
I can offer a couple ideas to kick us off, and then feel free to jump in, Trevor or Sean. I think one of the things is cultural change, right? So, and I won't pretend to know the East Lansing Police Department, but I know the Chicago Police Department really well. And there are cohorts within that police department where folks have really bought into community policing and take more of the second approach that you're sort of describing. And, and community policing is this model where you're walking your beats to get to know your neighborhood, build relationships, and it's not enforcement driven, right? It's about the community. And among those cohorts, there is a completely different vibe. But unfortunately, that is a small subset of the units that make up that department. And most of the units are much more traditional, law and order, traditional policing tactics, there to make the arrests, there to do the enforcement. And I think you have to start somewhere. So it's a start. There are some units that are really focused on community policing that are sort of building this new muscle memory of what the job can look like and what it can be. You have to start somewhere. I think getting some evidence that those types of policing are effective at reducing violence, at building trust with the community, with some of the things that I think the police department genuinely cares about, will help to shift more of their resources to that model and away from some of the more traditional policing tactics. And I think some of that innovation is happening in small places, at specific departments across the country. But the more that happens, the more there is some innovation and departments that are willing to sort of go beyond what's constitutionally required and create higher standards for themselves. The more that happens, the more it allows folks to study that, prove that it's effective, prove that it works, prove that the community is better off across a number of metrics. And then that can help build a little momentum to do more of that for more departments. But I also think it really takes sustained community involvement and pressure to get police departments to pay attention, because they have a ton on their plate. They're doing a lot. They have huge jobs. And without the community bringing it to the forefront for a sustained amount of time, I don't think it ends up getting the sort of attention it needs to go through a process that leads to true change, rather than just some sort of, small changes along the way.
And I agree with that. I think, one of the things that we talk about a lot is we need a new idea around community safety. And where we are now hasn't always been. This is an invention. This was an idea, right? How do we protect our property? The landowners. If you don't have a military, who's going to protect our property? We're immigrants. So we put our guns together. We protect the right to carry. And so one of the things that we've talked about is establishing an Office of Community Safety. And inside of that office is an Office of Youth Safety through the Michigan Breathe Act, the federal legislation. There are 4 parts of that legislation that really is a new idea around community safety. This is not about hating cops. This is about loving community. This is about protecting the sanctity of life. And within the Office of Community Safety, guess who's at the table? Who's building the table? Community members are building. What do community members know what we need and what they need to stay safe? Establishing a different communication when there are mental health crises. And so we need a collaboration, and we need community to believe that we don't have to have police to be called to every incident. There are communities that are doing this around the world. You talk to even some of the older police, they'll tell you that they, served 25 years and never drew their weapon. Never drew their weapon, not one time. Why? Because it was about community. There is some direct correlation between police violence and youth gun violence. And so one of the things that one of the police officers said is that they don't get a scorecard. They don't get a scorecard as to how many people have you stopped in this particular category. They're not aware of their own indiscretions. And so I think it's important. So I want to give a couple of different, things that are moving. The People's Response Act, if you've never heard of that, you should read that. The People's Justice Guarantee and the Breathe Act. These are all new envisions around community safety. And so I just want to lay that out there. And again, when we look at the community safety aspect, this is a reimagining of community safety. This is around community safety grant programs and funding to establish local community safety agencies, establishes an office of survivor support and harm prevention, free them all matching grant programs, neighborhood demilitarization grants. And there are many different ideas that are happening, and community is at the center. So Trevor?
I'll just lift a couple of things out that you both already said, but having metrics on so that we understand what is happening in police interactions. Like we don't understand any of this. There are some dashboards. There's about 120 dashboards in the country. When we did our last survey of this, there's no standard to them. And so I think we need to know more about what's happening in the system. So like the metric piece, I think both Angie and Sean talked about. And then I'm also, it's not at all related to my work with this brief, but I'm also interested in learning what we can learn from alternatives to the regular system. So there's an unarmed response that has been launched in Washtenaw County, where I'm from. It'll start in Ypsilanti and it'll be funded in Ann Arbor. And we'll see who delivers that, what communities deliver that. But I'm also hopeful that we can learn from that and kind of learn with how, like, just as I've said, we don't know what the police are doing. Like, I hope that when the unarmed response is active, we do learn what they're doing, kind of moment by moment. Again, not in an invasive way, but just so that we can understand what's happening.
I'll say so. I live in Durham, North Carolina now, which has a Department of Community Safety, which houses our alternative response and co-response programs. They have a wonderful publicly available dashboard to sort of give transparency to how what they've been doing has been working, and they're running a number of different models. But I think it's a really important point to think about. We're here tonight to talk about best practices and use of force, but use of force policy is really only one component of that, and it's broader policing practices that contribute in a lot of ways to when force ends up being used. And so thinking about implementing alternative response, co-response, making sure that you have social workers who are available in mobile crisis teams 24/7, all of these sort of things that aren't really asking, if anything, it's asking police to do less, to say, hey, you don't have to be the answer to all of our problems. There are other people who have skills who can bring their skills to bear and help solve these problems. And it's so huge in affecting use of force, even though it's not about the use of force policy. It's about when are we asking an armed person to respond to a problem.
I was recently stopped, and it was about midnight, and the officer stopped me and he said I was illegally driving in the left-hand lane. And I said, I've never heard that, officer. And he said the left-hand lane should only be used for passing. I said, wow, I've been driving a very long time. Never heard that. But I said, however, I was passing the van, which is my family, and they're parked behind me, and you've got your hand on your gun. He said, license and registration. I said, why did you stop me? I just told you I was abiding by the law. And I said, officer, if I was 12 or 13 or 14 years old, I probably would be dead in about 30 minutes. But because I got something to live for, I know how to de-escalate you and me. So I pulled out an international ambassador's badge that I have from the United Nations. He shined his light on that and he said, ain't nobody ever told you how to talk to the police? I want to answer that question. We don't see each other. We don't see Black men and Black women as human. From a theological perspective, we know that violence and murder are two indicators theologically that a society has stooped to low levels unmatched. Those are two theological levels, in that in a just society, the law protects the most vulnerable. So am I the most vulnerable or the officer? Until we change how we see each other, especially our BIPOC community, we are going to continue to have this problem. And I ask you this: if George Floyd was Jewish, if George Floyd was Arab, there would be a total different response. If Ahmaud Arbery was not Black, Tyree was not Black, imagine how the white community would respond to a no-knock warrant where a young, promising female, Breonna Taylor, is accidentally murdered. This ain't no policy. This is culture. And without accountability, you can't change the culture. Dr. King said you can't codify, righteousness. You can't make people be righteous, but you can prosecute the murderer. So we have to have some difficult conversations, and we know that there are other ways that we can keep ourselves safe. I got 2 hand claps. Thank you very much.
Several questions online. I think that Micah Jasmine Smart has been trying to ask a question for a while. Micah, do you want to try to ask?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, yes, thanks everybody for this amazing meeting. This is it's so necessary. Just to respond to everything that you said in response to the last question, I feel like so much of this change rests on the ability to reflect on what happens, and reflect on what happens over the last year or over the last day in a police force. This is my question, how do police, at the municipal level, how do they self-monitor and self-regulate and self-reflect if there aren't standard metrics or any metrics at all that they're supposed to use to count their own use of force? Are you saying that that does not happen and that they're now then not able to self-monitor? And then if they are able to self-monitor because they do collect that data, how can it be made transparent so that I as a citizen can know to what town to move with my Black sons?
So I can start here just by saying I'm not aware of a nationwide standard of policing metrics. There is one at the prosecutorial level, there's one at the court level. Metrics don't keep people safe, but it's right to point out that if we had that kind of consistency, we would know more and we would be able to do things comparatively. I think that being willing to hold yourself accountable is a human question and a cultural question. And so that culture piece is also consistent across the things that we've been saying.
And I think also the relationship between the police and the prosecutor needs to be explored, because we win by prosecuting, and if we don't have anybody to prosecute, then we're not winning. And so we've heard from prosecutors who have said that we feel intimidated by police unions and sheriff's associations, that if we decide to do anything other than prosecute, then we're going against public safety. So this is a system that involves, again, and Trevor, you can attest to this, that even the data that the courts collect is very inconsistent. We've been doing a data project for 3 years with the Vera Institute of Justice. And now that we have a new prosecutor, that entire project has been halted and we no longer have access to the data. Why?
And even in contexts where, so in Washtenaw County, we're doing a study of the prosecutor's office in partnership with Michigan Law. And there it took us 2 years with full access to the data to assemble a data set that we could start to analyze and understand, because all of these systems are case management systems. So they're not built for you to aggregate and then learn from that. They're built to track each individual case. So we are learning that, and other people are learning that. There is progress that's happening, but
Yeah, I think to the question of self-regulation, I think self-regulation is really important among departments. And I think this is where a clear policy that requires every use of force with a clear definition of what a use of force is be recorded is super important. And I think some of that is happening in East Lansing, but I also think, looking at a year's worth of incident reports, there was a little bit of shift. Like, the reports were very short prior to December 2021. Then they got a little bit longer in 2021 and they're on out. So I think there must have been some sort of change, but they're still not super consistent, right? And so it makes me think that a form that really has more fields to complete would be really helpful, because then that does not only start the ability for internal monitoring, right? Because supervisory review and leadership review of those incident reports is hugely important. But I don't know what the public availability of a compilation of use of force incident reports currently is. I know I was able to get it in advance of this meeting, but having this publicly available so that it's easy for residents to have full access, so that both academics like Trevor can collate the data and study it in a robust way, but also so that residents in general can have insight into what's happening and be able to hold the department accountable in their own way, I think is equally important.
So we know that in certain municipalities and cities, the Brady list is not readily available. And it's like a child coming home and never having to show their parents their report card. Well, I'm doing great. And so there are many, activists who are advocating for the Brady list to be made public. And again, think about that list being made public to the community. That really shows police conduct and how many times that police officer has been reprimanded and where they are in the process as it relates to the department's policies and procedures.
What is a Brady list?
Go ahead. You can tell me.
Well, I don't use that term. I believe he's using it to refer to the list of use of force incidents, right? So all of the use of force incidents.
Absolutely, that's what it is.
Oh, that's what you're.
Yes,
using it as?
absolutely, yes.
Excuse the interruption.
That's okay. No, that's why we're here.
Yes, my name is Ralph Wansma. I've been active in the juvenile justice system for many, many years and have followed it somewhat in my retirement in terms of going to a whole bunch of different programs which are set up by different agencies, all of whom seem to change their names now and then, so you can't really keep track. But I would like to just reflect on your latest little dialogue about data and about where you would get assistance for it. Michigan State University is one of the places where people show up at those different organizations, people who are in the School of Criminal Justice, there's people who are in the School of Social Work, people who are in very interesting different places. I mean, the law school is one of them too. And they come forward and they help. There's also a group of people who are in the community who have been following this, and some of them have won awards in East Lansing for that, in terms of their help with this thing. I don't want to mention names, but in the last year, all of you know a whole bunch of things that happened in our community which show evidence of what you have been talking about in terms of the difficulty of data and what happens when change happens and what happens with a public official that steps way out of line, it seems to me, and denigrates another public official who has a different perspective. And that was not used to be the way that it happened. It happened sometimes, but not a great deal. And I want to celebrate the good things that are happening, but when you bash the whole prosecutor's data system, and it wasn't that good, but when you basically say we don't need that, and I hope that's not what's really happening, if
No.
it is, it's a shame, but.
The contrary. The contrary, that's the work that Trevor Bechtel and the Vera Institute of Justice has been doing for 3 years, is we need better data management and reporting, more detailed. And with the little bit that we were able to gather, it showed that in Ingham County, African Americans make up 12% of the total population, but 58% of those prosecuted. And that number has not changed over the last decade. So while we're studying and we're continuing to have data projects, people are still being prosecuted, still going to jail, and still being murdered in the streets. So, you know, in church we say this is an altar call. Somebody got to come to grips with the reality of this conversation. And most African American parents have to have that proverbial conversation on how you de-escalate with police, because their training is insufficient depending upon where you are and what you're doing and who you are with. And that's unfortunate that we have to have that conversation.
Well, I just want to, again, this particular last little piece has put together a lot of what you were talking about before. And if you do not know where you are going because you keep no records and stuff like that, I mean, how in the world do you even compare, so to speak?
That's our point.
Even with the business of, you know, hate crimes, for example, there's just an article on the paper again. There's no way to figure out where hate crimes are going. I mean, the reporting back in terms of what a definition of a hate crime is, and the reporting back percentages of the police departments, it's almost as though it doesn't exist. Again, how do you manage without that kind of data? And when the community will not provide the money and the staff to do that, what do you say? It is not important. You do not feel it is important. And it's tragic. It is tragic.
3 more hands raised online when you're ready.
Okay, let's go to the online and then the man in the white shirt.
Okay, so I think iPad, whose name I don't know, is the next.
This is Tom Wilson from Perth.
Good. Oh, that's
Hello,
right.
all.
Hi, Tom Wilson.
Good evening, and thanks for letting us join in. You know, Chuck is in Ukraine right now, Kharkiv particularly. So he appreciates the opportunity for us to chat a little bit and just share a little bit about what we do as an organization. So I just want to hit just a couple of things. One is that first question by the gentleman who even talked about a family member in Atlanta. One of the most important pieces when it comes to changing culture and policing is leadership. Leadership, number one. That chief is going to make or break a police agency. I'm going to give you some examples of that. If you look at Camden County, New Jersey, if you look at Volusia County in Florida, if you look at Baltimore City now under the direction of Michael Harrison, those individuals are making changes in those organizations. So police leadership absolutely makes a difference. And why does it make a difference? It actually goes to the second question, the young lady that asked about, you know, how do they self-monitor? So we have 50 states, right, with different regulations. We have none that are consistent. We have some that are like the state of New Jersey, where the AG's office provides a number of controls in policing. We have others like the Baltimore, Washington area where there's a lot of regulation in policing. And then we have states where that regulation is minimal, so it goes from some to a lot to non-existent. And so what that means is the agency itself is making determinations on what is important and how do they train their people, how do they hold people accountability, and what data do they share, right? So if those mandates don't exist, then that information is not going to be provided to the public. It's just like this. There are chiefs of police, there are sheriffs all across the country who make a decision that I'm going to put every piece of information that my agency does, I'm going to make it available and I'm going to make it online. I'll give you an example. Go to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. You're going to find all of that information. There's many agencies that do that. They make that information available to you. In the reality, look, policing is local, right? We have 15,000 to 18,000 police agencies. Some of those are non-law enforcement, if you will, but we have 15,000 plus agencies, and every one of them does it different. So if that police leader is not trained, if it's not selected by the community, if it's not the right selection for that position by the community, then you don't know what you're going to get. So you select the right person. You make sure that police leader has the opportunity to obtain training. Don't forget, police chiefs were what when they started? They were police officers. They went through training just like every other police officer. And I agree 100%. There has been so many things that body-worn camera has changed. It has opened the eyes of police leaders and said, holy cow, we have so many training scars that we need to fix. And how do we do it? We do it by learning from it. We do it by holding each other accountable. We do it by learning. We do it by talking. We do it by having these type of community meetings and walking away and going back to our police department. I'll give you one example, and then I'll quiet up. Tyree Nichols, that event happened, and our executive director put out an email to all of our 3,000 plus members, police chiefs, academic leaders all across the country. And he said, if you want me to come out to your department and sit down with your folks, your police leaders, and talk about what happened there, I'd be glad to do it. And several of them took advantage of it. And we went out, we met with those agencies, and we sat with their supervisors. And we said, how do you ensure that this doesn't happen in your police department? And those sergeants stood up, those lieutenants, those captains said, these are things we need to do to make sure this doesn't happen here. And how do we do it? That leadership steps up first, and then that culture, it is driven down to the rest of the agency. So it's just like that gentleman talked about in Atlanta. If you don't pick the right people to train your officers, then you're going to get the first guy or gal that says, oh, I'm going to teach you what I learned back in 1990. And then you're going to get the next individual who says, that's not the way we do it here in Atlanta. So all I can tell you is leadership makes a big difference. Think about that as you select police chiefs, as you elect sheriffs throughout the country. Those are important pieces. Thanks.
The man with the white shirt, you still have your question?
Yes, I was raising my hand for my friend. So.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Lamaya Cotton. I have been a restorative advocate for the last 2 years in the local Lansing School District. And the premise of
Can you either stand up or talk louder?
I'm sorry. Hi, everyone. My name is Lamaya Cotton, and I have been a restorative advocate for the last 10 years, within the Lansing School District. And I really moved into this field because of the travesties of school to prison pipeline. And when we talk about critical decision models, does this entail restorative justice practices, prevention, or intervention? Self-regulation strategies where tactics center multiculturalism and different social identities, but also foster accountability and a sense of ownership for those who cause harm or contribute to harm. Are there any task force within the departments that will hold individuals accountable? I know you mentioned there are cultural cohorts in the Department of Chicago Police Station. As civilians, how can, in modern day, present time, how can we hold them accountable? And ultimately, what does existing in my black body look like if I was to leave here today and something happens to me and I become just another piece of your data just by simply existing? What advice can you tell me that I can extend on to my children?
The critical decision model question is for perf. Right, so, but.
And Mordecai was talking about rethinking community safety. And that, which sounds an awful lot like restorative justice.
Mhm.
How what's the reality of that on the ground of programs like that?
It's a great reality, but there has to be the political will. I mean, because we know the forces that we're dealing with right now. There has to be the will to make this happen, and the community has to actually rally, because oftentimes elected officials will not move until the community says this is what we want. And so that is our recommendation, is for all the community to rally around what's right. Again, so there are other communities who are centering the Office of Community Safety, and within that also establishing the Office of Youth Safety and Survivor Safety. So where you get specificity of care and love. And so the other thing is that we have to understand that DEI is not the end all be all. We have to talk about anti-Blackness, right? And so there's some hard conversations that we still got to have. And so, you know, I think for us, it's all about equipping the community to raise their voice and to say, hey, we know exactly what's keeping us safe. It is reported that the SROs are selling weed and smoking weed with our children in high school.
What's an SRO?
School resource officer, AKA police. So this is the reason why the community has to rise up, because there isn't the political will. It is, I mean, there isn't a politician from here to Australia that would even sign their name up. There's a few on the divest, invest, and really make an investment in the community. Why is that taboo? I don't understand this. And so we have to make an investment in community. Our communities have been divested. They've been defunded, truthfully. And so we have to take the money that's coming from ARPA, that's coming from ESSER, and just think from Texas to Washington State, over 100,000 Black students are suspended every year just on that one corridor. So we have to ask ourselves, what's hindering community from looking at the data that we already have and saying, let's put our heads together and come together and reimagine public safety. And we've not even really talked about the psychological effect that this is having on police officers, because I'm still a pastor, and police officers have pastors. And there are things that they will say to their pastor they won't say to their chief. And so we have to have these conversations.
And I do think as you engage in conversations around reimagining policing, there are examples from across the country where restorative justice conversations have been a part of that reimagining process, where police and community have come together, led by a restorative justice practitioner, to hold conversations. I've heard from police officers and community residents who have partaken in that process that it's been really impactful and helpful for them. But I also think it's only been done in a very small number. And so it has not had the sort of impact that you would want it to have, because each of those conversations takes resources and a willingness and an open-mindedness that to do en masse has not yet happened. And while I see a lot of value in those conversations, I don't necessarily envision departments undertaking enough of them for it to reach enough of the community that has been impacted by policing disproportionately to really make a difference. I'll say one other thing, which is just that, I think the strength in the ALI principles is that they're guiding on best practices. What I think they gear us toward is cultural shift and cultural change, but that takes a lot of time. And if I, in my own, like not speaking for ALI, but speaking on my own professional and personal opinion, would I advocate for certain categorical bans on use of force because I think they're quicker to implement, they're quicker to enforce. And so there are things that with time you can work on culturally, but there are things in the meantime while you're waiting for culture shift to happen that are really important to have. And I think, there's a lot of conversation around banning chokeholds and strangleholds, shooting at moving vehicles, which right now, I think East Lansing has exceptions to when it's allowed. And I think best practice is really moving toward getting rid of the exceptions. I think something that isn't talked about nearly as much, but I know Sean mentioned briefly in his presentation, he mentioned German Shepherds and canine use of force, right? Which has a history in slavery enforcement and is still used in policing to this day in ways that are harmful to community, harmful for a variety of reasons. One, an animal is not a piece of technology that performs consistently every time. So there are liability issues with that. There are also just cultural issues with using animals in a violent way that perpetuate, so many things. So anyway, I think canine use of force is one that should be on the table for banning, and considering really looking at it. And there are certainly canine use of force incidents in the reports from the past year. So, I think while most of my comments have been about general principles, I think really thinking about specific things that you can just take off the table as quicker things to enforce is certainly worthwhile.
You want to do another online question?
Yeah, I think iPhone has a hand up.
Yes. Hi, I want to thank the panelists for all that they had to say. I know there's been a lot of discussion about the importance of training, and I'll say my name is Jennifer Colina. I'm a professor at Michigan State University in the School of Criminal Justice. And I just want to say, I know there's been a lot of talk about the importance of training officers and diversity training. And I definitely understand that. But at the same time, I know too that while there've been many police officers have received implicit bias training, diversity training, cultural sensitivities training, de-escalation training. And there, when we think about some of these high profile cases, some of these officers themselves had gone through the training, right? But yet we continue to see so many people, 1,000 men, women, boys, and girls dying at the hands of the police. And there's really no evidence showing that training actually can change officer behavior. People can go through training, but it doesn't necessarily show that it will change behavior. And certainly when it comes to the importance of diversifying the police force, and I'm certainly a proponent of the importance understanding the need for diversity. But I will say that there are also some studies that show simply hiring just more Black officers, for example, does not necessarily result in significant improvements in policing. Some studies show that there's no relationship between officers' race and policing outcomes. Some studies show that Black officers can hold the same racial bias as white officers. Some show that Black officers may be more likely to discriminate. So I just say all that to say that there's a mixed array of studies that show the effectiveness on diversifying a police force and its ability to actually change outcomes. And I want to say that, when we think about reimagining the police, again, there are some commonalities between, rank and file police officers and what's being proposed when it comes to reimagining the police, right? The reality is, I think, Pastor Holland said this, that we depend on the police to solve so many social problems, right? We look to the police to solve issues of abuse, abandonment, homelessness, domestic disputes, unemployment, school disruption, a host of societal problems. And many officers themselves will admit that we unfairly look to them to solve all of societal ills. And that they themselves are not necessarily well suited to having to deal with issues of drug overdose and mental health addiction. So I think it's important to also highlight that there is some commonality between what community activists are saying and even what some police officers feel. And I want to say, again, Pastor Holland said this too, it's so important to invest in communities, because in communities that have low crime rates, we do not see heavy police presence. These neighborhoods are well off, they are well connected, and they are well resourced. So it's important that minoritized communities are also seeing some of these resources being placed within their communities. So I just wanted to make that note. Again, I know there's always pushes for training, but I get it, but we've been saying that for so long, and we continue to see so many Black and brown people dying at the hands of the police. And I will say again, studies are mixed on how effective it is in actually changing police behavior. Thank you, everyone.
Beautiful.
I'll just tack one thing on to that, and I'm happy for any kind of response. So thanks for that. That's a great comment. When we started our study, and looked at diversity, we found, like you, that the studies were mixed, and that you needed to achieve a threshold of 40%. So if you had 40% officers of color above that threshold, then it did make a difference in the culture. But you were often exceeding the demographics of the area that you were in at that point, and so we wondered about that. But there's been some further studies that we looked at that came out after we started this in 2020 that looked at who an officer was policing. So what the environment, like where they were being assigned, and then what the result of that was. And when you match that, so again, this requires much better data. But when you match that, then we did find that there was a significant decrease in violence, especially against Black civilians by Black officers. And so it seems like if kind of better data models are applied to this question, diversity could actually be better than previous studies thought. But it's certainly the case that the culture of a department matters, and particularly, as was mentioned earlier, the culture of leadership. So like one stat that we found was that the rates of fatal shootings by officers are almost 50% higher in cities with police forces led by white police chiefs than in cities with Black police chiefs. So, following on a lot of what you said there, and then the one piece here is that we've known that gender has mattered for a long time in most contexts. So,
I'd like to also add a little piece to that. If you go to the National Sheriff's Association website and look at who they're bringing in to train, it's problematic. We all have a computer and a smartphone. Just go look at it. So when you look at who is actually conducting the training, you have to ask yourself, what are we protecting and serving once again? And then when you look at Cop City and the intersectionality between policing now and the overreach on environmental justice. We are invading on indigenous land and decimating Black neighborhoods to build a military training facility to train police officers from around the world. Who are we going to war with? You've already went to war with the Black community in the 80s. There's 700,000 Black men behind bars. There's your nation. So we have some realities. Cop City, why? When the Lansing Police Department increased its gun numbers, and it was ironic that the amount of guns in community increased. So the point I'm making to the police officers that are here, the chief, is that when you build Cop City and you invite problematic individuals to conduct training, you are not saying that we are safe. And here's the reality. We either fight or flight. And to run from a police officer, and this is the other thing about culture, it is not that I'm resisting, I'm afraid. It is a natural human response to run when you are afraid. And all of the police officers I know, they say, Pastor Holland, we are trained to eliminate the threat. So I asked the question, well, with the young white gentleman that went into the church and shot all the Black elders, they took him to Burger King when they arrested him. So you've proven you can de-escalate, that you do have control. I was in Buffalo at Tops, and we were there supporting families. And this is what they said, that after he walked into the grocery store and shot all of those Black folks, the police officers arrived and protected him and escorted him through the police station while they were asked to stay in the restroom while he came through like a celebrity. So we have to ask ourselves, how are we able to have such wonderful discretion and protect the sanctity of life? And in other cases, we have no discretion. So you can't keep doing these kinds of things and say to an aspect of the community that you're safe. We're going to run every time. We're going to run every time. So we're trying to train our young men on how to interact with you all. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the problem is we've been in this for 400 years. So this is a call to the police chief, to the police department, to put a moratorium on killing Black people. Award your police officers for protecting life. They say if you want good behavior, reward good behavior. So what are we rewarding? I would like to ask the police officers who shot Van Aden, why was it so necessary to shoot this young man back towards the open door of the Meyer? We got no explanation. I just want to know. And the bullet is still in him. So I feel like crying right now, because it took George Floyd to wake many of you all up. But we've been screaming that we don't feel safe for a very long time.
I have Amanda and then Mary.
If you would like to go. I just have two things. One is, there's been a lot of talk tonight about standards, and I get the impression that we're trying to convince police departments to up their game, to keep everyone safe. I'm just gonna say what I want. I don't want police departments to self-monitor. I want communities to monitor their police departments. And I want this oversight committee to have some real authority over the police department. Everybody needs standards. Every profession needs standards. And I'm happy, really happy to hear about the guidelines and the standards that have been lifted up here tonight. I'm a social worker. We have standards. We also have licenses. And if we violate our license, I can be dragged up before a magistrate at Lara, right? I can be sued by anybody that I have violated their rights as a social worker. Why aren't police licensed to be police officers?
In qualified immunity.
Amanda?
Okay. First of all, thank you, Mary, for saying that, because you pretty much were saying one of the things I wanted to say. To the people who are here tonight, thank you for showing up. Thank you. By the way, so you know, we are on the Council of Three Fires, the Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, and the, I know all these, I'm just a little nervous right now. And help me out, people. Thank you tonight, and so I want you to know what lands we're on. Thank you for that. I just want to say a couple of things on into the question. First of all, the East Lansing Police Oversight Commission, a lot of the things we've talked about tonight, we're actually trying to actively work on. We go to the use of force, and we are trying to build a data set that's worth looking at. And in that area, just trying to, and the police have been helping us trying to build that a better service. So I appreciate our Captain Pride, who comes every week and responds to our many critiques about what we need different. So thank you. I appreciate Mary saying that we need to be supported and we need the community to help us continue with this. As well as the licensing, I think is really important. And I want to ask you all, what are your thoughts about police being licensed? And I say this because as a social worker who is trauma informed, it doesn't just take one training. It takes a career of training to get it better and do it right. And I feel bad for the officers because they're not getting any of the training to actually do real trauma-informed de-escalation. So I go back to the question, what about licensing the police? What are your thoughts about
fully support. But, you know, I think it takes state legislation to do it well. Ideally, you want state licensure. And so I think it's another emerging best practice. And it really helps to ensure that just because someone, you know, if an officer is dismissed in East Lansing, they can't just go get another job, you know, down the road. So I think licensing is a great practice.
Just for awareness, in most states, they don't call it licensing, but law enforcement has to be accredited, right? In other words, that officer has to be a state certified officer. So that is the case in most states. And if they don't continue that ongoing training, then they are decertified. So don't think that there is no police licensing. It's just a different term, but it actually does happen.
Yeah, that's all.
The step that's missing though, like her, I'm a professional with a license in veterinary medicine, and there's a review board that is not my boss in the event that I break the law or I, am negligent in my duties, that I go before and could lose my licensure. That's not there in the police profession. Mr. Holland, you've brought up qualified immunity a couple of times. Is there people working on that at this moment in time through the state legislature, through the court system, both?
Yeah, there's work happening on the federal level and on the state level and that's a part of the reimagine. I keep using public safety, not reimagining policing, right? That's only one portion. It's reimagining public safety and ending the carceral state. And so I think that's a part of it. And that goes back to the young lady's question about closing down the school to prison pipeline, right? But right now it is uber taboo to talk about reimagining public safety that may require a reallocation of funds to go into the community. It's a political hot button. And we're losing our community in the midst of a political conversation. So that work is actually happening on various different levels. And so there's a national campaign that's going to be launched by a couple of our groups. And you'll begin to hear a lot more about that. But again, ending qualified immunity is harm reduction. The crime has already happened.
These improvements.
Yes.
When you don't have qualified.
Yes. And the wiggle room within the law as well. So when something does go wrong, there isn't a clear standard, like for myself as a mandatory reporter, if as a clergy, I have to say something. If I don't, that's jail. Like there's no wiggle room in that. Oh, well, I didn't think they really meant it. No, there's no wiggle room. But what we see time and time again is you have local law, state law, and federal law. And depending upon the nuance of the situation, there's so much wiggle room. Breonna Taylor's case, what we're all looking at, and we say there was clear, someone broke the law, even here in East Lansing. We're not saying that the police officers are, inherently evil, but we are saying they broke a law, they broke city ordinance, and they broke their own policy. So there's no accountability for that. They get paid leave. So again, these are the things that we're dealing with, and we're calling for a complete reimagining of this entire system, because when you value Black lives, you value all lives.
Thank you.
Are there any more online questions? There's a gentleman in the back with the baseball cap.
I just wanted to point out that there is license in Michigan, officers are licensed, and their license can be revoked, suspended, and it happens all the time. The Commission on Law Enforcement Standards revokes officers that get in trouble all the time. There's a backlog of investigations. There's 2 investigators that are busy all day, and the commission takes action when cops are found criminally in the wrong, and there's action taken on their license.
Don't you have to convict a cop first before they can take away their license? They have to be criminally convicted?
Some standards require conviction, that's an automatic revocation, but there's also the standard that states character fitness. So when some people are, plead to more minimal crimes that isn't a felony, it could be character fitness that revokes them, prohibits them from coming back into the profession. So it's pretty strictly regulated in Michigan, not in all states, but Michigan does have a license. And if they get in trouble, the commission takes action.
I have a question for you, sir. Now, my license requires that I do several trainings throughout a course of a period of time, and that I have to turn in that training if the state asks me to. Do the police have to do the same thing where you have trainings you have to turn in and be monitored?
You'll be happy to know that a law just changed in Michigan. It's mandating in-service training.
So that's just changed?
That's just changing now. There's gonna be mandatory in-service training.
So that's important too.
And it's gonna be tied to license.
Yeah, somebody outside the agency monitor those trainings.
Do we have a hard break at 9 o'clock?
That's the idea.
Okay, well, let's go to the I don't know whether you wanted to, it's you, the man in the white shirt.
I'm Carrington Kelsey. I'm part of Black Lives Matter Lansing. Recently, we just saw a change in police reform that's coming from insurance policies, right? Because they're looking at the rates in which they have to charge the police officers, and not only police officers, but police unions, for them to cover X amount of incidents within policing. In order for us to actually have an actual paradigm shift or a change, we need that same form of accountability, where we can hold police unions and police systems themselves accountable in 2 ways, where we have oversight commissions that actually have teeth, that can actually make recommendations that have to be followed. As it stands right now, we look in the state of Michigan, we look at policing, most oversight commissions, if they exist at all within the state of Michigan, they don't have the power to make recommendations. So, at the same level, if we want the actual systemic change, because when we look into the data, we see the same stories, we know the outcome, we understand it's actually what's going to happen for Black and brown communities when we come into contact with police, right? We know at what rate that murder will happen, we know at what rate will bullets be released, but we don't have an institutional change, right? Something that checks and balances that not only holds policing accountable, but holds the state accountable for these failures that are committed by state-sanctioned violence. So when we get to that point where we actually have systems that have actual systemic power to change things, like these oversight committees that are everywhere, that are deeply ingrained to their community and made other people who are directly affected, we will not have police reform or police change. We need to take this money that we're putting into policing that just increased, if we look at the city and the state budget, and put that back into community violence intervention. And we look at community violence intervention, and we look at through the lens of John Hopkins and the Bear Institute, it decreased violence and harm in the community by 33% at being implemented, like, I think it was 3 years, less than 3 years. And this data is there, right? We have these things, we have tangible change, but we have to actually see who has the power to not only recommend these things, but change that system. DEI work only documents the harm. It doesn't change the system.
Can I ask the panelists, maybe starting with Mr. Wilson, for any final comments that they have?
Look, we appreciate the opportunity just to chat about the kind of the national level and what's going on. We encourage you to go to our website. We have all of this documentation, like our guiding principles on use of force, our ICAT training, which is a de-escalation training that fortunately has been studied. It did go through a randomized control trial, and as the one professor talked about, we worry about outcomes, and we're seeing outcomes and there was the right outcomes in the results, which is reduction in use of force, reduction in injuries to suspects, and a reduction of injury to cops, which is all important. And as I said, leadership matters. So picking the right police chief, that police chief holding their people accountable, creating these accountability systems. All of these pieces are important. So we just leave you with an opportunity for you to look at our website, follow what we do, and I hope we can be part of your conversations in the future. Thank you.
Any final words?
Thank you so much. It's been a real honor to be over here in Lansing tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's been wonderful.
Likewise, thank you very much.
And I just wanted to recognize the people that actually put this together and made it work uneventfully. Catherine Grosso.
There were 36 people participating online for most of the conversation. So, wide participation online.
And the Wizard of Oz is Chris Root. She's the choreographer of Oz. Thank you very much.
My interest is always for people to come and participate. So if you haven't signed the attendance sheet for today, please do so we can inform you about later events. Thank you very much.